why I made reference earlier to the idea of the selfish gene. Dawkins characterized human reproduction as selfish. That's wrong, because the human reproductive pattern is multi-generational. And if you want to establish the pattern of fatherhood that's going to cascade down the generations, that will make your descendants successful in a multi-generational manner, then you follow the spirit of adventure, and you imbue your children with that confidence. And that's how that pattern that establishes the dynasty, so Abraham is the father of nations, is established. So human reproduction is way more complex, and we figured that out. That's why we put the crucifix at the center of our society. Because we figured out, even though we didn't know, we figured out that the stability of the community is predicated on the willingness of the individual to sacrifice. And the exploration in the New Testament is the limits of sacrifice, right?
So do you think that that's what people think of when they think of the cross?
It's very hard to think about. It's very hard to know what people think about. I would say it depends on their level of sophistication.
Right, that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
I don't think it's ever been explained to me that way, and I don't think most people think about it that way. When they think about it, they think Jesus died for our sins. There he is. Praise Jesus.
Right.
It's a very
formulaic,
surface level understanding.
Well, I think
of what
it's
it is
partly because it's partly, and there's a merciful element of it. And this is what Jung was referring to when he said that religion helps protect people against religious experience. The full revelation of the significance, let's say, of the imitation of Christ, which is supposed to be the foundation of Christian belief, is in fact the demand that you walk the same pathway. And that's it's the most terrifying demand, because so Jung described the Christian passion as an archetypal tragedy. Now, there was a reason for that. So think about it this way, think about it technically. So imagine that 100 great storytellers told the most painful possible story. And then imagine that you aggregated all those stories and you distilled them into one story where all the terrible elements were present. Okay, so now you have a representation of the worst life can throw at you. Okay, so let's take that apart a bit. So the first thing that makes a tragedy tragic is that the tragedy befalls a good person. Because if a tragedy befalls a villain, it's just justice. It's not a tragedy. So it has to be a good person. So then, to amplify that, you would not only have the tragedy befall a good person, you have it befall a good person that everyone knew was good, but was not only good, was the best, and that was persecuted because he was good. So that sort of limits it out in that direction. And then you might say, well, what does he have to face? Well, the answer would be, well, the worst life has to offer. Okay, early death, early painful death, early painful, humiliating, unjust death at the hands of his friends, at the hands of the mob, under the thumb of a tyrant. Right. Brought about by people who knew that he was not only good, but the best of men. That's an archetypal tragedy. And then it doesn't limit out. So then you have the death that occurs in consequence of that, and it's voluntary acceptance. But that's not where it ends, because the mythology surrounding the crucifixion story insists that Christ harrowed hell after the crucifixion, which meant that he confronted not only death, but malevolence itself, and in consequence transcended both. And so what's the underlying psychological message? It's something like the calling and the voice of conscience informing people that in order to thrive properly in life and to become who you could be, if you could be everything you could be, you have to voluntarily take on the weight of the worst life has to offer, including the depths of malevolence itself. And you think, well, obviously, Joe, you know this. Like, how are you going to adapt to a situation you won't even admit to?
Right.
Well, so how could it be otherwise than for you to become everything that you could be, you have to embrace all of the catastrophes that life has to offer. Like, how could it be other than that? You're going to hide? You're going to pretend?
Right.
How's that going to work? No one thinks that'll work.
Right.
And so, and you're right, there is this defensive element to the particular particularly the Protestant religious tradition, although I don't want to single out the Protestants specifically, that insists that, you know, the work has already been done. But there's a lot of ambivalence about that in the Christian canon, because there's an equal insistence that, no, you're supposed to take all this on voluntarily. And that not only that, that's such an interesting idea, because it makes so much sense psychologically. So imagine that as your courage grows so that you can confront more and more of the horror of life, that a spirit begins to develop within you that gives you a strength that's commensurate with your daring. That's walking with God. That's the same thing. So the promise is that if you had the courage, something would be with you to allow you to bear up nobly under the burden. And all the clinical evidence supports that proclamation, because what you see in people in the therapeutic transformation is that insofar as they're willing to confront what terrifies them voluntarily, they get stronger. And then imagine that there's nothing but a metaphysical limit to that. And I think that's right. I can't see how it cannot be right.
It makes sense, and it resonates with how we know people that have overcome great things in their life and become these very unusual and unique people.
Yeah.
I gotta pause because I have to use the restroom, but let's jump right back
Okay.
into it. Where were we?
Well, we were kind of bringing We Who Wrestle with God to a close, I would say.
Yeah?
I've got other projects I want to talk to you about.
Okay,
All right?
sure.
We're launching Peterson Academy today. So, online university. We hope. We'll see. We're launching with 20 courses. Best lectures in the world. Very, very high quality production. We invited the best lecturers I could find down to Miami. 8-hour courses on the topic they really want. Highest possible production quality. And we're hoping we'll make a high-level, university equivalent education available to everyone for approximately 1/20th the cost. So that's the plan. Want to see the opening salvo?
Sure. Yeah. Put it up, James.
Yeah.
Why did
Let's
I
take a look.
decide
I
to
ran
build-
this before my lectures, this last tour.
You got to put the headphones on for that.
Yeah, okay.
Why did I decide to build an online university?
Well,
There is a crisis now in higher education.
The president of Harvard University resigned today, weeks
Does
after
calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's code of conduct?
We have a problem with affordability and cost, spiraling student loans. We have a groupthink emerging, and that warps the entire academic enterprise.
I experimented with putting my lectures online and found that I could teach far more people at very low cost than I could at the university. And I thought, well, why not scale that? What I'm hoping to do is to find the best lecturers in the world and to bring them to as wide as possible an audience.
He came to me and he basically said, I want you to do the best course that you've always wanted to do.
We want to bring you the highest quality education possible at the lowest possible price.
It's extremely high-level content that anybody can use to educate themselves, and it's available to everybody.
Well, that would be good. I think it's funny, because I got canceled at the university, so I could try to return the favor.
I think they're doing that to themselves, right?
yeah, well, we couldn't have a better marketing campaign than the universities themselves.
It's similar to what's going on with mainstream media.
Yeah?
It really is kind of the same thing. But
Yeah, well, it all
canceling
derives
themselves.
from the same source, right? Is the capture of higher education by this God-forsaken ideology that's
Bizarre.
scam artists, because there's no barrier to their participation.
Right.
And so we put a $450 cost on our offering per year for the early adopters. That's available now. And we're hoping that the fact that there has to be a bit of a financial sacrifice on the front end will make our social media network high quality and clean, because there's a little bit of skin in the game to participate. So we've taken the best elements of the popular social media networks and amalgamated that, and we're hoping that we can produce a community of people who are responsible and achievement oriented and upward striving and intellectually curious and bring them together so they can form their own communities as well as participating in the lectures. And so I'm extremely excited about this. The courses, we got lucky too, because we set up a production studio in Miami, and we have state-of-the-art film crew and editors, but just when we started to film, the AI illustration capacity came online, and we filmed everyone against a white background. And so we can fill the whole background with imagery and graphs and comments. Can you run a trailer for, just pick one of the courses at random, because this is actually how the courses look. So the trailers are very tightly edited, but so are the courses. And so let me show you one of them so you get a sense of what we've managed to accomplish.
Lot of fascinating questions. Where do we come from? Where are we going? What is the universe made of? How can we possibly understand the grand landscape of the cosmos? When you look back in space,
not only living peers, but peers in the historical tradition. And it gives you an opportunity to meet the person that you might be with for the rest of your life. That's a big deal, and it's a selective opportunity because you bring bright kids together who are hardworking and they get a chance to meet each other. That might be the whole value of an Ivy League education. It's hard to specify these things. Now we're trying to replicate that on Peterson Academy with the social media side. And, that's a new technology, we don't know how it will work, but the fact that it's selective and it won't be full of trolls and bots and bad corporate actors should mean that people will build social networks that are of high value. Because that's one of the things, obviously, that's what you do in a bloody MBA program. It's not what you learn in an MBA program that confers the value of the degree. It's the fact that it was bloody difficult to get in because the GMAT is an IQ test, essentially, and the social network you build in the MBA program. You carry that with you. Well, we're doing what we can to replicate that online. And we're going to make sure that we offer potential employers a record of our students' progress and success so that they have some sense that the person who they hire has done the apprenticeship work on their own necessary to accredit them as a valid student and a hard worker. And I think we can do that. And I think we can do it more effectively than universities do it. I know how to measure these things.
It's going to be very interesting if that becomes a criteria in which people are hired. If it really does become a thing and it becomes something where people are accepting that as an education and seeking people out in that regard, it's going to be very interesting to see if more of those emerge. Mm-hmm. If you start a trend and then...
Well, at minimum, we can assure a potential employer of two things. We didn't attract a woke crowd, and we didn't indoctrinate our bloody students. So that's not a bad minimum. Right. You can assure intelligence, you can assure a work ethic because they've completed the course material improperly. We can ensure that's properly measured. But we can also say, here's a bunch of things they didn't learn. Right? And the courses are subversive in the most traditional possible way. So we have Larry Arnn, for example, who's the president of Hillsdale. He did a lecture series on Churchill. Now, where are you going to go to university to get a lecture series on Churchill? And Arnn was Churchill's primary biographer, or one of his primary biographers, so that's a big deal. We've got Nigel Baker from Oxbridge lecturing on the legacy of UK colonialism. Well, you're not going to get that anywhere else. And he's a great lecturer. He's a brilliant man and very, very courageous. And Larry Arnn is in exactly the same category. So the technology we're using is revolutionary in a variety of different ways. The lectures are high quality, but the whole ethos of the educational offering is completely different than what is on offer, say at the typical Ivy League,
right.
Harvard, for example, which is such a catastrophe. Like, I was there at Harvard in the 1990s. I loved that place. It was really forward-looking and aimed at excellence, with very minor exceptions, like truly minor exceptions. It was a powerhouse, man. And I went back and saw a bunch of my old professor friends a month ago, and they've all joined the free speech movement at Harvard, and they're fighting against their own administration. And these were like the best professors I ever met in my life. And that's what they've been reduced to.
When did it start?
Specifically in the universities?
Yes.
It started with the incursion of what would you say, modified Marxism in the 1960s and then really accelerated in the 70s. It sort of went like this. You know how things fail, gradually, then suddenly. And it hit critical mass in terms of failure probably around 2014, 15, pretty much when things blew up around me. That's why they blew up around me. You know, I mean,
And what do you think
ridiculous.
ultimately caused it to not course correct? What do you think ultimately caused these universities to give in to that?
Okay, let's talk about ultimate. So
Yeah.
let me tell you a story, an old story. So there's a myth from Mesopotamia called the Enuma Elish, which is one of the oldest stories that we have. And let me just lay out the story, because these ancient myths capture the fundamental dynamics of culture. They're winnowed to do that. Okay, so the Mesopotamians believed that the world emerged as the interaction of two forces. We already alluded to them, chaos and order. They had a god of order, Apsu. He was a male god. He's the patriarchy. You can think of Apsu as the patriarchy. And a female god, Tiamat. Tiamat is a dragon, and a dragon of chaos. And the word Tiamat is the same word etymologically as the word tohu vabohu, and that's the chaos that God makes the world out of at the beginning of time in the Hebrew accounts. Okay, so you have Apsu and Tiamat, and they come together. Chaos and order come together, and they produce the first world. And in the Mesopotamian account of things, that's a world of higher order gods. Now those higher order gods forget their ancestors and go about their business, and they get increasingly fractious and undisciplined and noisy and hedonistic and immature. And at one point they kill their father, Apsu, and they try to live on his corpse. Right. So you see an echo of this. It's very complicated. You see an echo of this in the story of Pinocchio. You know, there's a scene in Pinocchio where Geppetto ends up in the body of a whale. Okay, so here's the underlying biological dynamic. It's so remarkable. So imagine a society sets itself up according to a set of principles. And it stores, it creates a giant storehouse of wealth. Okay, that's what a carcass is. Right, so if you're a primordial herder, your wealth is in the bodies of your herd animals. Okay. A body is a symbol of stored wealth. In the Mesopotamian pantheon, the careless kill their father and live on its corpse. Okay, that's what's happened to the universities. So since World War II, the West has gathered huge storehouses of value everywhere. Harvard's a great example. Immense endowment. Remarkably valuable brand. Disney's another example. And what's happened is, and this happens all the time, if you have an unguarded storehouse of value, the parasites come marching in. Right, and they try to live on the corpse. Now, they can for a while because it's a storehouse of value, but they kill the spirit. Now, what happens in the Mesopotamian story is that chaos itself comes flooding back in the form of Tiamat, who's extremely, the goddess of chaos, who's extremely angry that her husband has been sacrificed by the careless denizens of the world. That's the death of God. So, yeah, and the savior emerges in the Mesopotamian story. It's so interesting. So the savior that emerges to set things right has eyes all the way around his head. So he pays attention, and he speaks magic words. That's Marduk. And so the Mesopotamian empire was an avatar of Marduk, and he's the spirit of responsibility that sets the world right. Okay, so what are we seeing? We're seeing the invasion of storehouses of wealth by the parasites, fundamentally. Has that killed them? I can't think through how you would rescue an institution, a typical upper-level university institution. What are you going to do? How are you going to do that? You're going to fire 80% of the people? Who's going to do that?
Right.
No one's going to do that. Now, you could say, well, we'll make DEI initiatives forbidden. They're kind of doing that in Florida. But all you do is change the words. I mean, that's what the postmodernists did with Marxism in the 1970s when it no longer was fashionable to worship Stalin, that everybody realized that he was a psychopathic murderer All that happened was the French intellectuals changed the terminology and they invented a form of Marxism that was even worse than Marxism, which was really quite the bloody achievement. Do I think they can be rejuvenated? I can't see how.
Well, when you have people like the president of Harvard that gets fired for plagiarism but maintains the exact same salary in a different job.
Yeah, as if demotion to a full Harvard professor was, well, you know, she's not suitable to be president, but she can still be a fully tenured professor at Harvard. It's really, she can, eh? With that publication record. I just interviewed Carol Swain. Do you know who Carol Swain is?
No.
Black law professor from whom Gay plagiarized much of her work. Yeah, fun. So what do you do with an institution that's that far gone? You saw what those university professors did at Congress.
Yeah.
And they thought they were right. They didn't even look put upon. They looked put upon and shocked when they were challenged by the congressman.
They're not accustomed to being questioned, and also to communicating outside of their bubble. And their bubble, where their opinion is held in high esteem.
Yes, and everyone else is an idiot as far as they're concerned.
Well, when the woman from Penn, when she was smiling every time she was answering these questions.
It was. I'd never seen anything like that. Like, I knew that the universities had become warped. And the warp is very deep. So I talked about the Mesopotamian story, and there's another angle of deep warping. So the spirit of Marx is a very old spirit. It was alive in the French Revolution. It was alive in the Soviet Revolution. You can trace it all the way back to the story of Cain and Abel, as far as I'm concerned. And the story of Cain and Abel is the story of the fundamental human dynamic after the fall of man. So, insofar as we're historical creatures, the story of Cain and Abel lays out the essential psychological conflict that characterizes human beings. And so you have Cain on the one side. So Cain doesn't bring his best to the table. He makes second-rate offerings and lies about it. And then they're not accepted by him or his fellow man or women or by society or by God, and then makes him bitter. And instead of learning, he takes his complaints to God and he says something like, well, what the hell's going on here? I'm breaking myself in half, making my sacrificial offerings, and everything's being rejected. What kind of stupid cosmos did you produce? And God says to him something very interesting and complicated. He says something like, you're blaming your bitterness on your failure, and you have failed, and you know it, and you didn't have to, but it isn't your failure that's making you bitter. You've invited something in to inhabit you that's turned you against yourself and what's good. He says to him, sin crouches at your door like a sexually aroused predatory animal, and you invited it in to have its way with you. And there's a sexual metaphor there. Oh yeah.
That's heavy.
It's rough, man. It's rough. You don't get to be a high school shooter till you've had 1,000 hours of brooding over your misery. And so that's what God tells Cain. And that makes him violently angry and murderous. And so he kills Abel. He kills his own ideal. And Abel, you have Cain, who makes poor sacrifices and whines about it. He's the perennial victim, shaking his fist at God and the world, refusing to learn from his experiences. And you have Abel, who makes the right sacrifices and aims upward. That's the pattern. Two spirits. That's the Joker and Batman. That's Lex Luthor and Superman. That's Voldemort and Harry Potter. It's Satan and Christ. Like it's this eternal recurrent pattern. And one of its manifestations is Marxism, and another one of its manifestations is postmodernism. And so this is a very old story. It's a very old story. And you can understand Cain's point, because people do break themselves in half in life trying to struggle forward, and they're not successes in their own eyes, and they're rejected by
but I am still going to show you how to install the plugin. So let's get Fancy-Gotchi going. Back to the desktop. Also change the create directory, and we're going to name... Okay, Now you do need to make sure that you have internet sharing enabled, and that should make everything work. You notice as soon as I did that, the lines and stuff were green on the screen. That means it's working. And hey, look at us. Now we have the fancy Squatchy going. Very cool. So you have a bunch of different themes that you can go through and change. This is the cyber theme. This is one of my favorites.